And when they were escaped, then they knew that the island was called Melita. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us every one because of the present rain and because of the cold. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. And when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand, they said among themselves, "No doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live." And he shook off the beast into the fire, and felt no harm. Howbeit they looked when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly, but after they had looked a great while, and saw no harm come to him, they changed their minds, and said that he was a god. In the same quarters were possessions of the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us, and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. So when this was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors. And when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. And after 3 months we departed in a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. And landing at Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days. And from thence we fetched a compass, and came to Rhegium. And after 1 day the south wind blew, and we came the next day to Puteoli, where we found brethren, and were desired to tarry with them 7 days, and so we went toward Rome. And from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Apephorum and the 3 taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the passage that we were able to read today, Lord. I pray that you use our pastor as he comes before us to present what you've shown him through your word. I pray that he preach with power, and that he would convict us in areas of our lives that we are failing you, or we're not serving you like we should be. Lord, I pray for those that were sick and weren't able to make it today. Lord, I pray that you would put your hand of healing upon their bodies, Lord. And Lord, I also pray for my little nephew Jude, Lord. Help him to have a quick recovery. And I ask all this in your name. Amen.
Thank you, Daniel. And when they were escaped, remember, of course, the last previous chapters where they were on a ship heading towards Rome, and they ended up, Paul was saying, hey, you know, if we travel now, we should wait here in this small harbor. They traveled all the way over to Crete, and they were in the small harbor, and they, or was it Cilicia, but anyway, it was one of those islands there, and they were there in the place called Fair Havens, but most of everybody didn't like to stay there. They didn't want to stay there. And Paul said, if we travel now, we're going to be stuck in bad weather, and it'll be very dangerous to travel. But they didn't want to stay there. They didn't want to winter in this Fair Havens place. There was nothing to do. It was all boring. They didn't want to stay there. And the captain wanted to get to Rome as quick as possible and wanted to take his chances there. The crew didn't want to stay there because, of course, they preferred the other harbor on the west side of the island, the northwest side there. So they tried to make out for that one. They end up in a storm, and God says, "Hey, you know, I'm gonna make sure that you're going to get to Rome, so you'll be safe. And as an added bonus, I will give you the lives of everybody who stays on the ship with you." And so he tells them, "Hey, you know, because God wants me in Rome, all of you guys will be safe." And so we saw how that when you are in the perfect will of the Lord, and God has given you a promise, and God has called on you to do something, and that you are in the process of doing that, that no action or event can prevent you from getting there. And so we're in that same vein of thought is the fact that he's in this great storm. There's many days they have nothing to eat, and there's nothing going on, but the angel of the Lord comes and says, hey, even though the storm is ordained of God to send you and cast you onto a certain island, you guys will be safe, and everybody who stays with you will be safe as well. And so they end up doing that a few times. Some of the ship people try to escape and run away. Or a few times some of the soldiers try to talk about killing all the prisoners, and Paul was a prisoner. And each of these times we see where the wisdom that was given to Paul, he instructed the soldiers, hey, make sure these sailors don't try to run away, because without them we can't stay safe. And then later on the council of the soldiers, hey, if we lose these soldiers or if we lose these prisoners, we could end up taking their punishment, even be killed for losing our prisoners, and so we don't want to do that. But the chief captain says, no, hey, Julius is the captain here that was in charge of Paul. He says, no, let's not do that. Let's keep them alive. And in verse 32. No, not there, but in chapter 27, in verse 43, but the centurion, willing to save Paul, kept them from their purpose, and commanded that they which could swim should cast themselves first into the sea and get to land, and the rest some on boards and some on broken pieces of the ship. And so it came to pass that they escaped all safe to land. And so they have escaped the storm, they've escaped the ship breaking up, and they've escaped the crew members trying to run away, and they escaped the death of the sword. And all of these, we saw how that the will of man and the actions of man, even though that they have a free will, even though that they can determine to do certain things, that they were all done within the context of God's divine will, and how that these things are not mutually exclusive, but rather that even though that they had decided everywhere along the way, Paul to give advice and the soldiers to take counsel on whether or not to kill somebody, and the crew members whether or not to flee, and the soldiers to stop them. All these work together for the divine purposes of the Lord to get them onto this island. And so all these purposes work together to get them onto this island. He says, howbeit, in the previous chapter, saying, verse 24, saying, fear not, Paul, thou must be brought before Caesar, and lo, God hath given thee all them that sail with thee. Therefore, sirs, be of good cheer, for I believe God, that it shall be even as it was told me. Howbeit, we must be cast upon a certain island. So we see that all these actions were brought about so that they would be cast upon this certain island in the middle of a sea, where normally Paul wouldn't have gone on one of his missionary journeys. Normally none of these soldiers would have ended up there, and normally the Christians would not have considered this small little island as a place to evangelize, because there were much bigger areas to go to. And here in this, and in fact, a lot of Romans didn't even go here either, because this certain island was called a barbar. The people there were called barbarous people. Of course, you hear the Barbary coast and different things like that. But this is more of people that don't hold to the regular traditions or culture, or in this case, as people have studied this out, and I think their studies are fairly reasonable, is that this certain island was part of the old republic. Their mindset or their government or their culture was more of, because remember, Caesar Augustus at the time of Christ, the birth of Christ, when he declared everybody to be taxed, and Augustus took over from Caesar and a few other them. But Augustus was considered the first emperor. Caesar was considered like the first citizen or something of the republic. But then Augustus changed the republic into an empire. And of course, if I was a modern preacher, I would allude to Star Wars and turning the Republic into the Galactic Empire and all that weird stuff. But I'm not, so I won't be going that direction with this sermon. Amen. So there's nothing worse than a preacher preaching Star Wars. But here in this passage, we see that, of course, they're called the barbarous people. They say that the reason why they were called barbarous people was because they were more of the Republic faction. They really felt that this branch of the Roman people wanted to restore the republic. They wanted to do away with the Caesars, and so it would be kind of like the Democrats were in power and the Republicans want to cast them out of power and stuff forth. And so even though the Democrats are in power, the Republicans are not wanting to go along with the Democrats, and so we had the dual system of parties, and so this would be considered, in one sense of the word, the people that were on this island were of the republic mindset, the patriotic mindset, and the empire was more of a social mindset where the government had control of everything, and these people were independent people trying to. It's kind of like a lot of people would move up to Idaho because they want to have more rights and all these different things rather than move into the cities and so forth. So that would be kind of the reason why they called them the barbarous people. It's not like they had they were different in necessarily culture or anything, but more of a political mindset, more of a rural people, more of a less traversed area. Because Maltese was not, it was part of the empire, but it was not part of the main thoroughfare. Majority of people there was not. They were self-governed. They lived by their own wits and their own understanding and desired to be part of the republic form of government. And it wasn't part of the main empire's influence or concern because of the size of the island. And so they were called the barbarous people. In other words, they're not part of the cultural norms, and so they were called barbarous people. They weren't. It doesn't necessarily mean that they were evil or wicked people. It's just that, or that they had different religion, but rather they were not of the empire mindset of sorts. And so here they say they were escaped, and they knew that the island was called Melita. And so they didn't know where they were blown off course, and they didn't have any idea. But once they got into the island, they realized, and they talked to the people, hey, we're in Melita. And so that's where they ended up at. And the barbarous people showed us no little kindness, for they kindled a fire and received us everyone because of the present rain and because of the cold. And so here's this concept is basically, the idea is that if they had gone there just as regular travelers, if they had just gone there, hey, we're going to preach the gospel and we're going to do these things, or they came there in the mindset of I'm a Roman citizen and I'm here to bring Rome to you, they would not have been received very well. They would be like, who are you? We don't want to have any part of your political systems. We don't want to be, why are you coming to our country? What's your reason for being here? You come up to, like when you're door knocking out in the country and you come up to a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere and they knock on the door and the guy comes out with a shotgun and his 45 dogs and he says, what are you doing on my property? Just here preaching the gospel. Well, get off! And so forth like that. But because they came during the storm, they were received every one. It didn't matter, see, a lot of times when people are arguing over politics or religion or fighting over different things or property rights or this, that, or the other thing, usually they are not receptive. And the barbarous people were kind of like that way. However, when a natural disaster happens, a lot of communities pull together. And normally when somebody, like for example, when you are stuck on the road and you break down, you run off the road and you're in the snow, you need help getting out, you go up to that same farmhouse and he says, what are you doing here? Then you say, hey, I broke down on the road and I need help. Can I call somebody to tow me out? Then the farmer would be like, no, I'll go and get you. I'll go and help you. I'll go and do those things. It goes from somebody who's like resentful of you being there to somebody who sees somebody in help and need. Oh, I want to help you, and they pour out their heart to you to help you, because that's the farmer way, is that if somebody's in need or danger, you help them, you help your neighbors. And so that's their culture. And so here, the Lord orchestrated all these things around so that he ends up on this island in desperate need, along with 276 others that normally would not be received, other than maybe on the other side of the island where the bay was, where they would receive trade, but other than trade, they would have no real influence on the island, no reason to be there, and really no reason for the barbarous people to even associate with them, because they didn't really care for the typical sailors in the Roman atmosphere and stuff, and so they were just relegated to the harbor area of the island for trade and for products that they needed. But here, because of the cold, they were able to receive. And so we need to understand and realize that just because you are in a bad situation or you are in need of help does not mean that that God is punishing you or harming you or tormenting you or playing a joke upon you, but rather He is orchestrating a certain situation so that His people can bring the message to an otherwise unreceptive people. And so God here is working in the lives of all these people, over 276 people, to orchestrate a meetup, if you will, to the Maltese people. And the Maltese people, because they received them through the storm, was friendly and kind and talked with them and made sure that they had all the things that they needed and was able to help him. And because of the present rain and because of the cold. And so, presently, the situation is, it's the relationship between the Maltese people and the 276 is one of rescuers rescuing people from the storm. And basically, that would be more on, the attitude possibly could be, well, we're just going to help you, but I don't want to talk to you, and I don't care about you, and we're just going to help you through the storm, and we will be kind to you. But once everything is done, we're just going to go on our way, and that'll be the end of our relationship. But, again, God is working in this situation to where He brings another situation as Paul is being a servant. Even though there's 275 other people, in addition to the other islanders, Paul is gathering sticks for the fire. He's helping in every situation that he can, and here he is helping. And when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks, now a lot of people hate churches would use that to preach another message. Gathered a bundle of sticks and cast them into the fire. But anyway, so he gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire. There came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. Well, you see there, if you get a bundle of sticks together, you're going to have vipers. I'll tell you what. No, but anyway, no. So he said in here, and they laid him in the fire, and there came a viper out of the heat and fastened on his hand. So this viper, along with the bundle of sticks, was going to be cast into the fire, and he zooms out of that snake is very. You talk about a fiery serpent, right? That snake was on fire. He was angry, and he was ready to bite Paul and inject him with a bunch of venom. And the natives see this action, and it brings up a conversation with them about vengeance and about how that justice always gets her man, if you will. You know, how the Mounties, the Mounties always get their man, or whatever that is. The same way here is that it brings up the theological understanding of these people to say, oh, this guy, though he escaped the storm, is going to be killed for the wicked that he had done. It says, and a bundle of sticks, and when the barbarians saw the venomous beast hang on his hand. It's not just like a nip and zoom away. It was like hanging on his hand, and Paul's kind of like, whoop, he flings it away. And he says, hanging on his hand, they said among themselves, no doubt this man is a murderer. Here it is, a bunch of Roman soldiers transporting a bunch of prisoners, and they see him escape the storm. Oh, the storm must have been to condemn these prisoners, and because these prisoners are so evil and they were doing wickedly. You remember when Jonah was trying to flee from the Lord, and he wasn't doing what was right, and he was rebelling against God, that God sent a storm to punish him and to send him back on his way. The same mindset of these barbarous people was that, oh, the gods are judging these prisoners, and even though this prisoner escaped, he must have been a murderer. He must have killed somebody. So, and the most ancient law of the world at this time is, of course, if you kill somebody, then you yourself must be killed. And so here he's a murderer, and the storm didn't take him. So now the serpent that the natives know to be very venomous is going to take him, because justice always gets her deserts. And justice always, karma always comes back around and bites you in the end. And so here in this passage it says, no doubt this man is a murderer, whom though he hath escaped the sea, yet vengeance suffereth not to live. Vengeance suffereth not to live. So they have moved beyond just rescuers helping people, and then beyond your way to this thing, this wonder that they see is that the prisoner is getting bit. And they say, here's somebody who the gods, goes into the theological realm, the gods suffer not to live. And vengeance here, the word vengeance here, according to most people and to the Greek language there, vengeance is the same word or the same name here for the Greek goddess of justice or vengeance. In their theology, Zeus would be standing at the throne, and the Greek goddess of vengeance would be looking and watching, almost like Satan as the accuser of the brethren up in heaven. But this Greek goddess, Dike, I think her name was, is standing next to the throne in Olympus, and she's looking and writing down all the crimes of the people on earth, and then she's pointing out this crime, that crime, and Zeus is saying, put this judgment over against that person saying, put this judgment over against that person saying. And so the idea is that there's this lady vengeance, if you will, who is observing and writing down the crimes, similar to where Satan in heaven is accusing the brethren and so forth and all that. And so she's up in heaven, and so he tells her what decree they're supposed to have, and she initiates the decree and makes sure that it happens. So, this guy's a murderer, then this person needs to be punished. And so in their theology of that day is that there's basically a natural, and of course we have this too as well, is that there's a natural supreme justice. If you go against nature, or if you go against divine justice, if you will, then you will be judged and condemned. And if you react against justice or what is right, then there will be wickedness or anger against you from the Lord. And this basic understanding of law is basically don't do what is right, don't do what is wrong, and do what is right. Okay, and so this lady vengeance, if you will, in their theology, is the one who is trying to kill Paul. And so this guy must be a murderer. He must have killed somebody. And so this lady vengeance, the goddess of vengeance, suffereth him not to live. He escaped the judgment of the courts. He escaped the judgment of the storm. And now the viper is going to kill him. And he shook off the beast into the fire and felt no harm. And they're like, wait a second. We thought that the justice is going to avenge this person. Howbeit they looked, and when he should have swollen or fallen down dead suddenly, see, those are the symptoms. If you get bit by this thing, you're going to swell up, you're going to fall down suddenly. But after they had looked a great while and saw no harm came to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Who but the gods can defy the great lady of vengeance? And of course, we in our justice system have justice is blind and has the blindfold on and with the scales of justice and all this stuff. It's a similar concept. The lady of vengeance, and so in their understanding, no mortal man can defy the gods and live. And yet here in this passage, he seemingly defied the gods and lived. And so therefore, their only solution in their mind was he too must be a god. It's just similar to where the people, when Paul and Barnabas went and they thought that it was Zeus and Mars, Jupiter and Mars, and so they had thought they were Jupiter and Mars, and it's like, no, we're just regular men like you, and then they try to beat them up afterwards. It's like that's kind of like the natural concept of most people is that you're either a really evil person or you're a really good, godly person, or a lot of people deal in extremes. You're either really evil and mean, I should hate you, hate your guts, or you're my best friend and I love you so much. And so we deal in extremes. We go to one extreme to the other extreme. But here in this passage, both extremes, of course, were wrong. He was neither a murderer, nor was he a god, obviously. But of course, in their theology, the only one who could escape the justice of a god is also a god, because only the gods would have that power. Changed his mind that they were a god. And so in this passage, I want to kind of talk a little bit about the understanding of justice and the understanding of the natural order. And so there's three things that we need to consider. There's natural justice. If you, for example, if you know electricity is in a fence and the sign up there says 3,000, 60,000, or whatever thousands of volts that are running through that fence, and then you say, oh, I don't care about that sign. That sign don't mean anything to me. It's just a bunch of words on a piece of metal on a fence. I'm going to go ahead and touch that fence. What's the natural judgment? Natural judgment is being zapped, right? And so there is a natural response to violating or doing something wrong against nature, right? And so when something is against nature, that means there's going to be a natural response to it. If you stand in the middle of a thunderstorm, in the middle of a field, in the middle of nowhere, holding onto a flagpole, are you going to survive or are you going to die? You see, I'll do my chances. Would you have better chances if you stayed in a house with a lightning rod on it, or would you stay or out in the middle of a pole holding a flagpole? So unless the flagpole is maybe not metal, but anyway. And so we understand is that there are natural consequences. And this natural consequences to life is that if you violate that natural consequence, you're going to receive the judgment of that consequence. And so the natural consequence of getting bitten by a viper is basically to swell up and die. Right? That is the consequence of that. That's what they expected. So, and so in their understanding, that is the base level. The base level is that there's natural consequences to things in life, in nature. God has ordained certain things to happen, and equal and opposite reactions and all these different things and scientific procedures, that if you are in the way of these natural events and occurrences and you deal with them without knowledge, then you will receive the punishment of being ignorant of that natural force. And so the base level of doing what is right is obeying natural law. Now, you obey natural law and you'll do what is right. Now the only way to get away from natural law, of course, is that if you are in divine law. And so divine law rules over natural law. God has placed and determined what natural laws should go in process. So you got your fires, you got your storms, you got dry wood, you got waters, and all these different things all working together. You got the whole universe working together in natural law that God has determined at its creation that they should eventually unfold in certain ways. And unless God directly intervenes with divine law or divine intervention, that these natural events will occur. And so the base for a human being is to, whether you are a believer or an unbeliever, everyone knows that you should obey natural law. You cannot go outside and defy a thunderstorm by holding a flagpole and think that you're going to go unscathed. Now, do some people hold a flagpole in the middle of a thunderstorm and survive? Yeah, occasionally the lightning doesn't strike and God's mercy is there. But typically, if they try to defy natural law, unless they interject another natural law, they're not going to survive. But then, of course, here in that base understanding of nature is also human law. And so we got three different laws. We got natural law, which is governed by divine law, and then we have man's law. So there are things, remember when God gave a commandment, is that, hey, if a man sheds innocent blood, then by man's hand that guy should die, right? That is a divine law that was given to a man that if he kills a man, which is against divine law, Like if, for example, I kill a person, then that person can't come back and kill me, so that's not against natural law necessarily. In that instance, for example, but it's against divine law, so divine law is given an obligation to man to make a human law to prevent me from killing other people. And so human law is commanded by divine law to prevent me from killing people. But if I continue to kill people, and human law does not intervene and stop me from killing people, then divine law will bring justice upon me, judgment, the judgment of God. That's what the Revelation is about. That's what the flood was about. That's what the law of Israel being sent out into the being dispersed from the land was all about, because they had defied divine law. And so these three things working together, human law is supposed to prevent you from defying divine law. And so that this human law will keep the divine law away from the natural order. So for example, you have divine law that tells human law what to do, and then you have the natural law. Now, of course, that's how it's supposed to work. In the system, divine law commands humans what to do, and then humans do it, and so they obey natural law along with that, which is that base level of that's how nature works, and so you're respectful of nature. You respect nature. But there is, of course, we understand that human laws are not always perfect. They don't always follow the scriptures. They don't always follow divine law. And so a lot of times people will say, well, I can do this because it's legal. But if something is legal according to human standards, doesn't necessarily mean it's safe according to natural law and according to divine law. Like, for example, if today we have abortion. Abortion is against God's divine law. But people kill and destroy and maim children in the womb. It's not violating necessarily natural law because they're doing it with impunity, and there's not a natural consequence necessarily directly seen in that. But it also doesn't violate human law, because there's not a law preventing people from doing it and then taking them to court and condemning them and giving them a human punishment for what they're doing. But it violates divine law. And when you violate divine law, you're going to send upon yourselves judgment and destruction. And God gives those warnings in the scriptures. Because when you violate divine law, you basically violate moral sensitivities that God has written on your heart. God's written divine law in your heart, so even though man's law may not be correct, it may not necessarily go against natural law, but it'll go against moral divine law. It'll morally decay a person. So Romans chapter 1 is based upon people define divine law, which would be they knew God, they honored Him not as God, and they gave themselves to a reprobate mind, and they started doing these things that would turn out convenient and against nature. So they start defying, when you start defying God's law, then you start defying man's law, then you'll start defying natural law. And then when all these things happen, you go down the spiral of judgment, you go down the spiral of destruction, and so forth. So all these things work together. And in this understanding is that they are understanding that he is being judged by divine law, and that the nature is going to be used by divine law to judge him. And so so we see how that in this passage, the snake is part of nature. Snakes, don't like fire. Snakes, the storms are part of nature, and so forth. And so in their understanding is that human law is supposed to prevent you from defying natural and divine law. And so you have, of course, when you have human laws that tell you, hey, then you're not allowed to dump toxic waste in the environment because that'll cause harm to nature, right? So you got human law is supposed to take care of natural law. And then also you have human laws that are supposed to prevent you from, human law is basically like this. For example, human law is right here, and here's the cliff of divine justice, if you will. Human law is supposed to keep you from going over that cliff and bringing divine justice onto society as a whole. So if society as a whole ignores your violation of divine law, then they will reap the punishment upon all of society. That's why if you do wickedly, then the land would spew you out. And all those things work together, those three types of law. Sometimes they are divine and natural law are always in connection, are always in harmony. And so divine law and natural law always work together to bring about justice upon mankind, who is also spiritual and human, or natural as well, part of both realms. But because of sin, because of wickedness, obviously man's law does not always go in harmony with God's divine law and natural law. And here in this passage, they always saw that whenever humankind violates natural and spiritual law, then nature is going to work with spiritual law to bring about vengeance against that man. And so this was the natural understanding of the world, and that's how the biblical understanding goes as well. And so even though that they referred to this as Zeus and the goddess of vengeance, Dike, the principles they were working off of in their understanding was also correct. And so a lot of times when we see somebody referring to pagan gods and goddesses, we want to rise up and say, hey, you know, those gods are fake, they're not real, and they're not correct. You know, we want to argue against the pagan gods and argue against all this stuff. But here in this passage, we basically see that Paul does not necessarily start preaching against Zeus and Dike and all these things, but rather the principles that they're working off of are used to help them understand, hey, this guy must be a god. And so it moves on into another section here. The native people start seeing this person not as somebody they're rescuing, not as some. And so we can see how that the God uses their understanding of divine and natural laws to bring about justice, and then seeing how that he defied divine and natural law by not swelling up and dying shows that either he's a god or something unique and special is about this person. And so God used everything in this passage, nature bringing a storm, God used the pagan mindset, and God used a natural snake. He used all these things working together so that he would open up and make these people have an interest in the spiritual things that Paul would bring to them. So if this guy must be, so we go from natural to being a god. Oh, this guy must be evil, somebody that I should have nothing to do with. Oh, this guy's an outsider. I don't want to have anything to do with this guy. And then God using the process of understanding mankind and understanding where they're coming from to them thinking that this guy's an outsider. Oh, okay, we'll help them because of the storm and the cold. Moving them all the way to, oh, this guy must be divine. This guy must have some spiritual wisdom to give to us. And so you see how God is using the events in people's lives and the understandings and the concepts to draw them from where they are to where they need to be. And here in this passage, we move on from this situation on the beach to, oh, this guy must be a god. So instead of just kicking him out to the coast and waiting for the next ship out of here, they end up inviting the guy in the same quarters. There were possessions of the chief man of the island. Now this chief man of the island is the guy who's in charge of the island. And his name is, the chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. Oh, this guy must be a god. He must have some wisdom. He must have some knowledge that defied divine and natural law. And so there must be something about him that we need to know. And so we must entreat him very courteously, rather than being as somebody they rescued out of the sea and get out of here. Now he stays 3 days. And during those 3 days, what does Paul naturally do, of course? I believe, of course, here in this passage, uses sickness and so forth, and we'll get into that in a minute. But basically, he uses the situation of those 3 days that God allowed and orchestrated so that he can witness to Publius, the chief man of the city, or the island, and his father, and help heal his father and minister to these people, so that they can eventually lead them to the gospel, lead them to Christ, and lead them to understanding. And so, in the same quarters were possessions of chief man of the island, whose name was Publius, who received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And so again, going back to this being a barbarous people, and understanding them to be more of people who desired to have the old republic back, is the guy who's in charge of the island. His name is basically loosely translated the public. His name is the public, if you will, Publius, the public, the general populace, if you will. So this guy is the chief person of the populace, the guy who, and so this is his name, but it is also a title of the chief citizen, or the chief person of the populace, if you will, is what his name is called. And so everybody calls him the public. And so he's the representative of the island. He's the guy in charge. And so he's called the public. And who receives us and lodges us 3 days courteously. So on behalf of the island itself, this guy as their representative is lodging him. So it's not lodging him just because of Publius, but because the islanders saw this stuff and they wanted to, as him being representative of them, to care for him publicly, to care for him while he's on this island. Must be a god, must be somebody who is very divine. And he received us and lodged us 3 days courteously. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and of a bloody flux. Basically, he was burning up, very sweaty, and he was coughing up blood. Is what he was, and a lot of people believe this is called the Maltese fever, and it basically was from a bacteria that would grow in the local sheep or the local goats that would contaminate the milk. And so basically he was sick. He was infected with a bad bacteria of the local milk, if you will. The milk was contaminated. And it came to pass that the father of Publius lay sick of a fever and a bloody flux, to whom Paul entered in and prayed and laid his hands on him and healed him. And so the reading of this passage, a lot of people believe that Paul, of course, yes, he laid hands upon him and he also healed him through all this, and the Lord healed him. But the understanding of this passage is that it was he gave him medical care. So the understanding is basically Luke, who was a medical doctor, and basically this island in the middle of nowhere doesn't really have medical doctors or a hospital or anything like that. And so all the locals have to kind of treat their own people. And so Paul goes in there, prays for them, and they believe that because Luke was a medical, if you will, was a picture of the first medical missionary, if you will. He brought his expertise. And so this passage doesn't necessarily say he miraculously healed him, but rather that he healed him, or he ministered to him, or he gave him or he knew the medications or the plants that he could consume in order to be healed. He used his knowledge, he used his understanding to heal him. It came to pass that the father publicly lay sick with fever, and then he laid hands on him and he healed him. So when this was done, so here you got a guy everybody thinks is a god, and then now he heals him and he gives him, which they believe to get healed is divine favor through him. And so they understand this. So when he was done, others also which had diseases in the island came and were healed. And so Luke is because God has orchestrated this, and he has orchestrated the fact that Luke, a medical doctor, is with Paul, that this doctor can help heal the sick on this island and bring the gospel to them. This is a custom that a lot of people do to third world countries, is to bring along with their missionary work doctors to heal the sick and other people to feed the poor and all these different things, is that they would do these things naturally. God uses us and has us a lot of people say, oh, woe is me, as I can't heal people miraculously and all these things, but rather God's given us natural things, a natural order of things to be able to, with knowledge, with understanding, to be able to heal people. And so here in this passage, he is healing the people of the island, whether by miracles through the laying on of hands and so forth, or medically being healed. Either way, the effect is the same, and he is being healed. They laid us with, and came and were healed, who also honored us with many honors, and when we departed, they laded us with such things as were necessary. And so in this passage, we see how that God orchestrated the fact that this island in the middle of nowhere would be able to see the gospel witness. Not only would they receive the gospel witness, but that God would work events in their life so that they would go from a resentful people to people that loved and honored Paul, so that he would be able to give and minister to them physically at first, and then also spiritually later on down the road. And so we see how that God uses events to take people from where they are to where people need to be. And in this passage, nowhere do we see, oh no, that the goddess and Zeus, they're all evil people. No, he says, hey, I'm going to focus not on what is wrong with your doctrine, but what is right. And so as I draw you to what is right, then eventually all that other stuff falls away. And so we understand this, and that he's not arguing against, this and that and other thing, but rather he's using all these events to bring people to God, to bring people to Christ. Who also honored us with many honors, and when we departed, they laid us with such things as were necessary. You see, it started out with the multitude people are rescuing 276 people. Should be these 276 people honoring them and oh, thank you for rescuing us, thank you for these things. Now it ends up at the end is that the rescued get the honors, the rescued get the blessings, and the rescues get gets the gratitude and all these things. They departed and laid us with such things as were necessary. And after 3 months, so they're there for 3 months, whereas it could have been just for 3 days or just until they were warmed up and dried and then back over to the island. And instead, they end up spending those winter months here on the island. After 3 months, we departed on a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, whose sign was Castor and Pollux. Now, Castor and Pollux is Gemini. Basically, you look in the sky and you see the Gemini, which is basically called two twins. In Greek mythology, Castor and Pollux are two twins. Castor was the twin that was born of natural parents, and then Pollux was the twin that was not born of natural parents, but rather born of Zeus, or the divine, and so forth. And so you have one twin that is mortal, and you have another twin that is immortal, and the immortal twin, eventually in the story, which is Pollux, is the immortal twin, his twin brother Castor dies and goes to hell, and basically Pollux calls upon Zeus, if you will, to share his immortality with his twin brother. And so that's in that picture there is basically the ship that takes them away is basically is figurative of now, of course, this is roughly, and obviously it's a ship, and you don't want to put too much allegory into this, but of course the allegory can be seen of how that the natural and the divine working together to bring forth immortality to both, to the mortal. And Gemini was a picture of basically, Gemini is of the ship, on the ship is basically, he would give protection to sailors. And so whereas you have the previous ship, the natural ship is getting tossed through in the storm and everything's all horrible and awful. And then the Alexandrian ship, of course, is taking them away, is one of divine protection, is one of immortality given to the mortals, and so forth. And so it's kind of interesting how that in this passage we have two references to Greek mythology, but rather it's not the Greek mythology that is emphasized, but rather the principles that they are to portray. And so in the first part of the Greek mythology, you have divine justice and how that God used their understanding of the pagan gods and the pagan principles to bring forth and teach in their hearts, according to Romans, to teach in their hearts basic principles of true religion, true godly justice, which is divine, natural, and human justice, all working together to bring justice about to people. But also here on the Castor and Pollux of Greek mythology to help them understand the difference between mortal and spiritual, and how that the spiritual would give the mortal immortality, and so forth. And so I use those principles to portray Christian ideas in this passage, and so forth. And in general, we can see in this passage where whose son was Castor and Pollux, and landing in Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days, and so forth. And so we can see how that God takes and uses what the pagans believe and understand, and their and concepts, and their natural desire to help people. He takes them from where they are to where they need to be in order to receive Christ. And so when we talk to pagans, or we talk to people that are not just like us, we need to understand that God is using where they are to bring them to where He needs them to be. And the way we witness to them will determine whether or not we can be part of that plan to help them to get them to Christ, or can be in opposition to that plan to help to prevent them from getting to Christ. Because if we were to focus on, oh yeah, those people think that I was healed because of this viper, that the goddess of vengeance of Zeus came to hurt me, and then I start preaching against Zeus and Dike, then they would be like, oh, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This guy's ignorant of divine law. This guy's ignorant of natural law. But instead, if we focus on the principles or the things that God is using in the concepts to manifest what is already written on their heart of God's natural law, then we will be able to bring them to where they need to be. We've got to focus not on what is different, but what is on the same, so that we can bring them to where they need to be. So oftentimes, we as Christians oftentimes see everything in a mindset of, if it's broken, we need to focus on the thing that needs to be fixed. And so if you believe in pagan gods, we need to fix that. We need to fix your understanding that, no, these pagan gods are wrong and evil and stuff, and so forth. And yes, that's true, but it's more important to focus on their salvation first, then after their salvation, work on, okay, what gods are true and wrong and whatever, and then get them corrected in the right priority, right order. So oftentimes, Christians want to argue and fight over creation with a lost person, and people, of course, use the reasoning, oh yeah, but if they don't get this understanding of creation correct, and they're not really going to believe in God and all these different things. But that's really a cop-out, because you need to focus on their salvation, help them understand the things that they already know. Like when I talk to somebody who says, oh, like for example, I talk to somebody at the door, and they want to bring up, well, the Bible, I can't really get into that Bible thing because it says 6 days of creation, and evolution says it's millions of years. I'll just say, hey, that's a wonderful question. Well, I can talk to you about it later. But right now, we're out talking to people about salvation, and about how you can have eternal life in heaven, and so forth. And can I show you the scriptures? And I step aside of that, because, yeah, that's an important thing. You need to figure that out. You need to believe what the Lord says about that. But the more important thing is that they be saved from a sinner's hell. And so I deal with, rather than focusing on creation theology, I will deal with what is already written on their hearts. I say, hey, you're a sinner, right? I've seen majority of people, even if they believe in 7-day creation or a billions of years creation, they know that they're a sinner. That's something innate, something natural, something we all have in common. We all know that we're sinners. And so if they know that they're a sinner, then I can then talk to them about, do you know what is right? Do you know it's not right not to lie? Do you know it's not right to covet? And everybody naturally, whatever whether they think themselves an atheist or an agnostic or what they believe about the creation, everybody agrees that it's not right to kill somebody. Everybody agrees that it's not right to lie. Everybody agrees that it's not right to violate the law, if you will. And when we talk about divine law or natural law, everybody knows it's not right to stand out in the middle of a field holding a flagpole, a metal flagpole in the middle of a lightning storm. You just don't do that, especially when you see lightning striking very close to you. You just don't do that. Everybody knows these naturally. Everybody knows innately what is right, what is wrong, and that they shouldn't be doing it, and that there will be a punishment for violating natural law, punishment for violating divine law, punishment for violating human law. And so when you deal with the things that they already know, and ignore the theologies and the arguments and how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, how Adam and Eve have a belly button, why are the ages of the people in the Bible so long, we only lived this much, and all these various questions of this, that, and the other thing. Rather, what you need to be dealing with is divine, natural law that they understand. And they understood natural law. They understood divine law. They understood human law and how they all work together. And that was what that needed to be focused on, not on their false gods primarily. Because when you teach them naturally what God of the universe, you'll see that's what Paul did on Mars Hill. He said, hey, you guys are superstitious, and he then left it there, and said, you got this unknown God, but then he brought it there. He didn't focus on preaching against Zeus. He didn't focus on preaching against that. Everybody today, especially in Christian areas, seems to know what is wrong with everybody else, but they spend less time on preaching what is right. They spend more time trying to prove everybody else wrong and prove themselves right, rather than trying to reconcile people back to God. And so we need to just, I'm not saying that we should live and allow people to go contrary to those things, but rather they need to understand the base understanding. They need to understand why you believe God. Why do you believe that God says in 7 days and not these things? It's because divine law, divine nature. So you don't debate whether or not it's better to go to church on Sunday versus Saturday with somebody who's sitting in prison about ready to go die on death row. You don't debate those things. It's just, but our priorities are out of whack. We oftentimes focus on other things. We need to look beyond those things that hinder and look to how God is orchestrating and working behind the scenes, using everything to prepare people to be reconciled back to Him, and rather use those things as objections against them, use those things as stepping stones to get them to where they need to be. And so that's what they did here in this passage. We see many references. We see references to their theology, but that was bypassed to deal with their principles of understanding divine law. And after 3 months we departed a ship of Alexandria, which had wintered in the isle, which sign was Castor and Pollux. And the landing there in Syracuse, we tarried there 3 days, and from thence we fetched a compass. Basically, they didn't say, oh, let's go find a compass before we get in a storm, and so it can go see where it's true north. But rather, it means they went around. They fetched a compass. They went around. They came, and of course, maybe they did fetch a compass at the local gift shop. But anyway, they came to Rhegium, and after 1 day, the south wind blew, and we came next to Puteoli, where we found brethren and were desired to tarry with them 7 days. And so we went towards Rome. So they're traveling towards Rome, and they end up land on Italy, and then they at the island coast in Italy, the Puteoli, they found brethren, and they stayed there a whole week with them. And so that includes the soldier that's with Paul, and they hang out a whole week there, and of course, he spends time with them, and he sees that he's on the island, or he's on the Italy coast, and he finds brethren. He finds brethren there, and he stays with them 7 days, and so he went towards Rome. He's there on the coast for 7 days, and everybody in Italy hears about Paul within a day's journey. And everybody that is a Christian within a day's journey of this coastal town starts traveling to meet Paul, and then he meets him as they went towards Rome. So as we went towards Rome, and from thence, when the brethren heard of us, they came to meet us as far as Typhorum and the three taverns, whom when Paul saw, he thanked God and took courage. So here he is, following the divine will of the Lord, when he's in Achaia and at the end of his third missionary journey, and he says, "Hey, you got to go to Jerusalem, and then you got to go into Asia Minor. You got to preach for me there, and then you got to go to Jerusalem, and then afterwards you're going to go to Rome, and then all these prisoners, all this imprisonment and bonds, they're going to follow you, and they're going to meet you in Jerusalem, and all these problems that you're going to have on your trip and your journey to get to Rome." And he's been informed of these through the Spirit, and he's having trials all the way through, but everywhere he meets and everywhere he lands, he finds brethren. Just think about this, brethren. He finds brethren all the way along the whole coast where he is traveling. And just to think about that is that him being a missionary, wanting to bring the gospel to all these places, he takes courage for the fact that no matter where he would go, even by this time, which is only probably about 30, 40 years after the resurrection of Christ, is that everywhere in the Roman Empire, there are brethren. There are people that he can fellowship with, people that care about Paul, and people that care about Christ, that he was able to take courage that, yes, even though I'm going to Rome to preach the gospel to the Roman Empire and preach the gospel in these areas that may or may not receive Christ, there are already brethren here. And so that encouraged Paul. Of course, later on, when he suffers persecution, that he eventually, they will, even though they honor him here and they visit from a day's journey, they come to meet him from these faraway places on the Italy Peninsula. He thanked God and took courage. Of course, later on in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 2, after several years of being on the island, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 9 through 16, we won't look at it, but basically it says, well, let's go ahead and look at it, is that, yes, there were people there and he took courage from that, but the sad thing is that a lot of these brethren eventually, through persecution or whatever the reason was, in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 9, which of course I believe many of the prison books, the prison epistles are written during this time. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 9 through 16 says, "Do thy diligence to come shortly unto me," it's talking to Timothy, "for Demeas hath forsaken me, having loved this present world, and is departed unto Thessalonica, Cretans to Galatia, and Titus unto Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Take Mark, and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry. And Tychicus have I sent to Ephesus. The cloak which I left at Troas and Carpus, when thou comest, bring them with thee, and the books, but especially the parchments. Alexandria the coppersmith did me much evil. The Lord reward him according to his works. And of whom be thou aware also, for he hath greatly withstood our words." And then verse 16, "At my first answer no man stood with me, but all men forsook me. I pray God that it may not be laid to their charge." You see, and that's, we may talk about that a little bit more later, but basically, he took courage here for the fact that there was a great witness there. And of course, Paul, even if they agreed with him or not, he was glad that there were witnesses there. And unfortunately, people when they get in conflict, they'll start forsaking their brethren. But here in this passage, we see a concept of not forsaking our brethren, but rather using all that God has orchestrated in our life, not to forsake one another, not to find ways to fight against one another, but rather use what God has placed in our lives for ways to reconcile one another. to circumvent the things that Satan puts in our way as obstacles, and use them as stepping stones to bring people to Christ and to have fellowship with the brethren and to take courage in all the things that we do. Whether we're stuck in a storm, whether we're stuck in an instance with a viper, all these things, if we're in the divine will of the Lord, we need to realize that no natural or human law can defy the divine will of the Lord, and we can take courage in the fact that if God calls us to be a witness in natural courts or human courts, that He will protect us and give us courage to do the things He's called us to do. Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you, blessed you, good Lord. I just pray that you'll help us understand the importance of following divine, natural, and human law, and the importance of following your divine law supremely. And if we do that, then no natural or human law can defy your divine law. And if we work in your perfect will, the Lord, that we will try to, as the best of our ability to be, is at peace with all three of these laws, types of laws, Lord. And I just pray that you'll help us to understand the importance of following natural, human, and divine laws in all the things that we do, not only to bring people all back in reconciliation to you, in line with the divine law, but also in line with fellowship with you, and in line with being with you and reconciled to you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.